This is Dan McLaughlin, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, this is fun. So we got a couple things to talk about. For those who don't know, Dan's been on a few times. He writes at the National Review, but he also has had a blog since the early days of blogging, and he talks about baseball. So I thought, Dan, we might talk. And you've got a Brooklyn Dodgers hat on. I didn't wear my Dodgers hat today, but I thought we might start with baseball and then see what kind of political stuff we can get. Everybody should check out the National Review. Go to Dan McLaughlin's page, and you'll always see some really good insight. And I would say that uh, you're looking for a best way forward, not a partisan way forward, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, we stand for something, and we write from that perspective. But I do think it's important to try to be fair in how you present things.
So I probably am strongest for the Dodgers, but I love baseball in general. But we had Brooklyn. I'm sorry, Brooklyn. Colorado is a weird stadium. Weird things happen. The fountain turns on in the middle of the game. A cat runs across the field. A home run goes over the fence and gets pulled back in and turns into a single, and an out instead of a home run. And then an inside the ballpark home run to left field. And again, where the ball was kind of brought back. It was an insane weekend. Do you like the fact that in baseball something absolutely unique, despite millions and millions of outcomes, absolutely unique can happen in a given game? Or what draws you to the game all these years later?
Oh yeah, I mean that's absolutely a big part of the appeal is that sense that you're always going to see every year something you've never seen before. Think of the what I guess we were commemorating the I think 20th anniversary now of Randy Johnson vaporizing a bird with a pitch. Uh, which was just one of those once in a million kind of physics moments that the bird it just had to be perfectly timed. But yeah, I mean every year I mean last year of course was a particularly weird year. I think hopefully we're gonna be back towards an increasingly normal year this year. But we're not there yet. I mean, as a Mets fan, I'm sort of frustrated that the opening weekend didn't include any Mets baseball because the Nationals had some positive tests. Um, so it's one foot in front of the other, but there will always be some something new, something different, and I think there's going to be some unexpected stuff this year. Uh, One of the reasons for that actually is that there was no minor league baseball last year. Um, and so I think you're going to have a certain number of prospects coming up where people really don't know what to make of these guys because they didn't put anything in the books last year. And some of them may be rusty, of course, but others may have sort of developed their skills a little and nobody really saw it happen. One of the guys who busted out over the opening weekend is Yermin Mercedes. Went 8 for his first 9, a 5-hit game in his opening appearance. He's 28 years old, and guy's been, he's sort of kicked around to, foreign leagues and the minors. But nobody really. I don't think he was on a ton of people's radar going into the season because you just didn't have, a recent high level competition of this guy.
Right, right. The other thing too with the minor leagues, also the pitching, because there was such a short season. A lot of that rhythm is gone because most of the season was spent locked up and protected from COVID virus. And so that there's a lot of unknowns injury wise and what can pitchers handle. You don't want to break a. I mean, look, when you've got players that are making $250,000, over the life of a contract, the last thing you want to do is explode their arm trying to win the league, win the division in May, and it's going to be interesting to see how teams approach this challenge. What are your thoughts? Like, is it overplayed the whole? We only played 60 games last year. What are we going to do about these pitchers? Or are these guys capable of throwing 150 innings or whatever that number is going to be? Relievers, are they going to go out there with 60 innings? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason why a guy only, I mean, it seems to me that if you have a healthy pitcher in his prime and he only threw like 70 innings last year, that you ought to see that as a guy who, yeah, okay, maybe you're going to be further into April before you feel stretched out. Maybe you're not going to feel stretched out quite as early. But it seems to me those are guys who should be able to carry a bigger workload this year. I mean, they effectively had 2/3 of a year off last year, and that ought to be. That ought to mean there's more miles left in the arm. On the other hand, look, there is something to be said for the idea that why did guys used to be able to pitch so many more innings, right? And part of that is, okay, yes, there are reasons in the changes in the game. The pitchers are more muscular. They have to put in max effort on more of their pitches and all that. But part of it is just that guys got in the habit. They got conditioned to throwing that much. Somebody like Satchel Paige. Yeah, okay. Page didn't have to go all out when he was pitching a barnstorming exhibition against a bunch of farmers, which was part of what he did. But the man pitched like every day, all year round for like 40 years, and that builds up the muscle. And yeah, there are guys who are going to blow out if you try that with them. But some of those are the same guys who, if you baby them and you treat them, as fragile objects, they're still going to blow their arms out.
Yeah. Some guys like Kerry Wood, Brett Saberhagen, these are guys that were brilliant when they were healthy and among the best pitchers ever, but they just didn't have the biology, the physiology to stay on the mound. I'm curious about your thoughts too. Well, let me ask you this: the Mets seem to be a bit of a darling in the media. Maybe it's because of an East Coast bias, maybe it's something else, but your team gets a lot of play. Where do you go for honest assessment of where the team is? Because it's easy to, and the Yankees get this, like every phenom is like going to change the world, and then they come up and you're like, not such a good assessment there. Cubs and White Sox get this a lot too, where the expectations are outsized for what the reality is likely to be. So how do you and maybe I'm unfair with that, but it doesn't happen much with the Marlins. Marlins are usually under expected. There are teams that have that. So do you agree that the Mets are one of those teams that kind of gets overhyped? And then
I mean, I think if you're talking about prospects, I mean, look, certainly the Mets have gotten over the last 20 or 30 years, I think the Mets have gotten far more bad than good publicity. And I think the New York media and the national baseball media kind of love to trash the Mets, and for good reasons. Nobody probably trashes the Mets more than Mets fans. I think that's obviously right now you're in a honeymoon period with new ownership, and people are really hoping that that's going to be different. But yeah, I mean, it is true that the big market certain of the big market teams have had a tendency to have their prospects overhyped over the years, and the Mets have had more than their share of those. I don't think that I need to worry about going to different media outlets to get an honest assessment of the major league players. I can do that myself, and I can see that. I mean, frankly, with the Mets, I think you get a good honest assessment from even the broadcast teams and the radio teams. I think that the Met, like the Mets TV and radio teams, they have some people there, first of all, who just don't care what you think of them, like Keith Hernandez, right? Keith Hernandez doesn't care. But also I think there's a sense that they understand that they have a bond with a fan base that doesn't trust the ownership, so they're not homers in that sense. In terms of getting an honest assessment of minor league prospects, I mean, I traditionally have gone to Baseball Prospectus and Fangraphs and some of those sites. I've been kind of a little turned off some of them more in recent years as they've grown more political, which is kind of there's an interesting divide there, because if you look at the older generation of baseball writers, there's some really vocal liberals there, your Peter Gammons, your Mike Lupica, but a lot of the older baseball beat writers are kind of conservative guys. Whereas if you look at like the younger generation, and by younger I mean like under 50, in some cases not far under 50, like me, there's an awful lot of that they're just preponderantly very far left wing, and I think that is kind of reshaping the coverage of the sport. And obviously that's I guess that probably leads us a bit into the All-Star Game controversy, which I think is a terrible unforced error on Rob Manfred's part.
This is, and I like calling it unforced error. You've got a brand that is I wouldn't say baseball is struggling, but like anything else, the NFL is struggling. They're all trying to figure out how to grow, and they've grown so much recently. What do you do? And I follow baseball for the play on the field, yes, but more importantly, like what guys like Andrew Friedman, what Brian Cashman does. What these GMs do is they try to build these teams and sustain. Like I find that fascinating how they move the chess pieces. I think Farhan Zaidi is great. Like the Giants might not be like believing it yet, but he's so good at building a system from like the 60th player to the top player. That's what fascinates me. And I don't need a guy like Rob Manfred to put politics in it. I mean, baseball is the thing that, on 9/11, baseball shut down for a couple of days and then they were back at it. Like they are just resolute. And I don't need social justice in that. What's how do we make a good does this make any sense? What's the positive spin for Major League Baseball out of this? Is there something good?
I mean, the argument in favor is basically saying that, well, I mean, I think there's a bait and switch element here, right? Because the you know should baseball be completely hermetically separated from politics, every way, in every situation, always, forever? Of course you can't. That's kind of a false choice, right? I mean, when baseball put Jackie Robinson on the field, that was in some sense in a big sense, a political statement, but it was ultimately about the benefit of the game, and it was about the game cleaning its own house. And it changed the country. It really did. It was one of the milestones of civil rights, much more than anything that happened in the NFL or the NBA. And yes, baseball has long promoted a kind of generic patriotism, right? The national anthem, which they started doing back in during the First World War. And even post 9/11, it was, there was obviously a political aspect to bringing the game back, to bringing out the president, right? I mean, the presidents have often thrown out the first pitch on opening day in DC, and it's been presidents of both parties. But I think there's a big difference between that and then saying, well, okay, because you let a little bit of general patriotism in the door because you took a stand against racial discrimination in your own business, that means it's always a good idea to dive into every political controversy and do so, as they did in Georgia, in a way that is very openly partisan, right? They are very much like saying, okay, everything the Democrats say about this bill that the Democrats don't like is right, and everything Republicans say is wrong, and we're gonna side all the way down the line in a classic nuts and bolts of politics controversy with one party over the other. I think it's a very bad idea, and I mean, it is true. It is a dangerous time for the brand of Major League Baseball. I mean, it's frankly, if your business is not Amazon, it's a dangerous time for everybody's brand right now. Everybody's trying to find their way through a new landscape of technology, a new post-pandemic landscape. But I think that is truest in the entertainment industry, which sports is part of, because there's so much fierce competition right now for the entertainment dollar. And football has had its own issues. And but in baseball's case, part of it is that kind of aging fan base that is the real installed traditional fan base. It is the competition with the NFL is something that's been an issue for baseball for 50 years now. And with the NBA for 40 years. And so you have a lot of different things going on at the tempo of modern life, that make it difficult make it a struggle for baseball to retain fans. And then obviously you have missing 2/3 of the season last year. But the things that are unforced to me are, number one, the league tampering with the rules in ways that are really big departures from history. And the other is forcing themselves into a political controversy they didn't really need to get involved
Yeah, I can understand that, and I can appreciate that. Yeah, why would you force yourself into a political controversy? Because the thing about baseball is that it's always had the ability to reach out internationally. It's not a black and white game. It's a game that has, I don't know how many I used to know all the times. I always found this was fascinating, but there's got to be 15 countries represented in baseball right now. I mean, I don't know if there's a Canadian playing, I don't know if there's an Aussie playing, but we could go on for quite a while naming the different places and players who come from a variety of places. And I think that's what makes baseball great. Like, remember the Dodgers UN rotation where they had 5 different countries represented in their rotation. You can become great at baseball from anywhere. I mean, Venezuela is a hotbed. Curacao has produced near Hall of Fame players. All these different places. I think that's more of anything. Like, anybody has a. You can grow up in, to the Dominican Republic, not known for its wealth and abundance, and you can still come there and then make a difference back in your country. It's more of an American game when you look at the opportunity to come here to play with the best, to make the most money, and do those things. Why even take this fight on? And by the way, it's about both. And there is a balanced scale that we have to have between access to votes and legitimacy of the vote, and tipping the scale one way or the other. It's Georgia's business, but Dan, I don't get it. I don't understand why you even take this fight on.
Yeah, and it's and look, I mean the again if Georgia was doing things that looked like 1965 era Georgia, 65 I guess when Major League Baseball actually moved a franchise to Atlanta. If they were still if then you could see taking a stand. But I mean, this is so marginal. So many of the things that are being done here. I mean, the big protest is over the food and no food and drink to people who are, you can't have people giving food and drink to people who are actually waiting online at the polling place. Well, that's actually, I mean, Georgia basically modeled that to a certain extent on a law that's already on the books in New York, where MLB has its headquarters. And that's not a brand new law in New York. It's been there for a while. And a great many states have laws that say like you can't even approach people who are online to vote. And so and you go down the list of things that were done in this Georgia bill, and it's a 98-page bill. There's a lot of detail to it. But by and large, I mean, it takes a number of steps to expand access to vote. And it tries to balance that with improving security and transparency. And you may not agree with necessarily every last call that's made, whether you're a conservative or a liberal. But the idea that like every tiny marginal thing in the voting procedures has to become a national test of morality is just insane. It's
Yeah.
just it's completely it's completely without perspective.
It does seem short-sighted. And again, if Georgia wants to adjust its voter integrity laws, I think that's appropriate. They just had this massive problem with trying to understand what happened. I don't think we'll ever have resolution. It's easy to say everything went to the courts and was settled, but if you look into it, that's just not true. And I'm not trying to make
Well,
a political statement, but there's real problems with the voter integrity in many states. So we have the technology to significantly improve this, or just go back in time and just hard count paper votes every single time. And by the way, if you
yeah,
buy
and that's part of what the part of what the bill does. It creates more secure paper for the paper ballots and that sort of thing. I mean, I just people are like, well, why does Georgia have to do this? It's like, okay, did you miss the last couple of years? Like they just had a governor's election in 2018 where the loser refused to accept the legitimacy of the outcome from the Democratic side, and a presidential election in 2020 where the loser refused to accept the legitimacy of the outcome from the Republican side. And on top of that, you had, things like the drop boxes and everything. You had all these emergency changes that were made in Georgia and across the country, but they were made in Georgia without even authorization in state law, right? The Secretary of State and the governor, that there were emergency measures taken. And so, it totally makes sense for the Georgia legislature to sit down and say, you know what, it's time for us to improve public confidence. It's time for us to try to do some things that in a way that people trust and that makes sense and that maybe gives something to each side. And I mean, in terms of things like the drop boxes, that takes a 1 year emergency experiment and says, okay, here's what the rules are going to be going forward for that now in permanent state law.
And let's just say this out loud, just in case anybody's. We're not saying that Donald Trump won the election. We're saying that Georgia felt the need to clean house on voter integrity. And that is not going back to Jim Crow, and it's not Jim Crow and steroids and all that, partisan nonsense. It's we're well past that stage. Let's not go back to it. And how many things are there in Major League Baseball where you have to show some form of ID? I mean, if you go to pick up your tickets at a game at the will call desk, for those that do that, you'd have to show some form of ID. You'd have to validate your 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 purchase online, your ticket online. I mean, you have to do these things. You have to show proof. And
yeah, and baseball teams. I mean, look, baseball teams will be the first to tell you that you know if you don't require ID, you can get scammed. I mean, think of how many controversies they've had with, say, Latin American ball players lying about their ages, right? And when you think about it, why is it the Latin American players who lie about their ages and not other countries? The reason for that is simple. It's because they can, right? Because this used to be a big problem with American-born players too. But, American birth certificate records are much easier to check now. So it doesn't happen with American players, but it's not because they don't have the motive. It's not because they're more honest. It's because we have better paper trails here than they have in, say, the Dominican Republic or Cuba. Obviously, Cuba. Sometimes it's just because the Cuban stuff is opaque because we don't have relations to Cuba. But, so, I mean, I think of voting the same way, right? Which is that people still have a motive to misbehave. And so you have to have just sort of basic elementary security measures so that people don't do the things that people on all sides will otherwise do.
Yeah. And I don't want to limit anybody's right to vote or access to the vote. And if we need to make exceptions to the rules, then okay, let's do those with an eye on always maintaining legitimacy. We have an election legitimacy problem right now. If your side won, you don't think so, but when your side loses, you automatically. And I'm not saying this election. Just go back however many elections, and whoever side loses is, like you said earlier, they're going to claim some kind of chicanery. Why is baseball getting involved in any kind of election chicanery? They should be above that or adjacent to it, not even part of it. You want to work with Georgia to do some kind of thing to improve the condition of a people. Focus on that, but don't. Why? Look, Dan, I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy going to a baseball game like I used to anymore. I feel like I'm being fleeced every time they get a chance. $15 beers and all these other things. So though I love baseball, I already barely consume any Major League Baseball. And because I live in LA and I don't have the right cable package, I can't even buy the MLB.com, watch any game I want package because the Dodgers, I get to see about 10% of the games, right? So they have all these problems. This is a major market, LA, right? Where a lot of people who would love to watch and do these things. But I'm disincented from participating in the brand already. And now you bring politics in, and I'm like, what are we focused on here? Are we focused on baseball, or are we focused on arbitrary things like voter rights in Georgia?
Yeah, and I think there's also, by the way, an additional historical irony if you know baseball history as to using the All-Star game as a vehicle for protest against ballot security, right? Because if you know what happened it was 1957, the Cincinnati Reds fans engaged in a massive, essentially, ballot box stuffing campaign and they ended up electing, I think, 8 Reds. And the Reds were like a fourth, fifth place team at the time, right? I think they elected, I think it was 7. I think they elected all but one starting position. Were all the Reds, and baseball reacted by taking the vote away from the fans for 6 years. Right? They completely eliminated voting and said we don't like this. This is too much voter fraud for us. Essentially, we're going to give the vote to the players and let them decide who's on the All-Star team. And it was like 6 years before they gave the vote back to the fans.
Another funny thing, I was watching MLB Network the other day because I can't watch a Dodger game. I have to watch MLB Network to get updates. And it was Harold Reynolds. God bless Harold Reynolds. But they had these guys. It was obviously a segment they had to talk about. It was really uncomfortable because you could see these guys were like, oh. didn't have a whole lot to say. Didn't, and these are sports guys; they don't have anything terribly insightful to say. But Harold said, why would Georgia want to limit what the people can say? Look how the All Star game is done. That's voted by the people, and it's like, yeah, and they openly stuff the box, right? Like, take as many
Yeah.
ballots as you want, vote for the A's or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, even today. I mean, even today, the All Star balloting is just notoriously rife with voter fraud, in a sense, in the to vote early and often. It's encouraged. The
Yeah, it's
league wants you to cast as many ballots as you can.
but not in an election, not in an actual election.
Yeah.
We want actual people to do actual good things. I guess let's. I wanted to stay on baseball for another minute here. Theo Epstein is sort of like the minister of fun and getting people to come out to the ball game. And obviously they need to work on these things because I think, look, you've got all these shortstops that are going to come out. Story, I mean Seager. I guess Lindor just signed, with the Mets. That's awesome for you guys, but there's only so many $300+ million contracts that can be doled out with any kind of a sane approach to this. And we've already got probably close to the limit on that. It's not saying that these next guys don't deserve it, but at some point, baseball does itself. I mean, like Bobby Bonilla Day is coming up, right? Like these contracts oftentimes come back to haunt teams. And so, like the Dodgers probably have three guys that are going to need deep into the hundreds of millions to sign them. So how does baseball proceed with that? Because the big multi-billion-dollar network TV contracts, that day's gone. They're not going to spend that money for that anymore because they can't sell the ads. I mean, there's less and less people watching ads. So when you look at the marketplace, getting people to the game, and also, at some point we need to have a real, agreement between the players and the owners because there's a lot of money being filtered into baseball that the players aren't necessarily getting enough of a taste of. At least I would think they would say that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the players always say that,
Yeah,
that they're yeah, and the owners always say that they're losing money, right? No baseball owner has ever admitted to making a dime off his team, right? But yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean, I think like the Lindor contract makes a ton of sense if you assume that the business of baseball will continue to be healthy. Now it could be even then it could be a disaster, right? I mean, no ball player is ever a sure thing. To stay healthy, to stay at the top of his game, to stay motivated. I mean, these guys, I think the true championship caliber athletes generally do not suddenly become unmotivated, but some guys respond better than others to that situation. So you never know. I mean, I think the Lindor deal makes sense, and it makes sense from a franchise credibility point, right? That the Mets in particular felt they needed to lay out big money, and not just big money, but big money to a guy who's obviously like in his prime worth it guy, and not just like spending a bunch of money on yet another like 33-year-old left fielder. But but it is true. I mean, if a whole bunch of teams lock themselves into big deals like this, and then the business takes a multi-year downturn, then you've got a real problem. Because no matter what your profit margins are, when you fix yourself into big long-term contracts and you start making a lot less money than you expected and projected to make, you're gonna have some pain. And you're going to have some shakeouts and things. So, but look, if people want to spend, if they want to increase the number of 200 and 300 million dollar deals that are going to, shortstops in their 20s who are legitimate superstar ceiling guys, and reasonably proven commodities at the major league level, I don't think that's all that irrational at all.
Until Trevor Story snaps his humerus or something, and is never the same player again. And oh my God, there's just history is rife with so many of these contracts that they just
right. I mean, look at Troy Tulowitzki. I mean, just as an example for Story, right? I mean, Tulowitzki was absolutely the kind of guy you would give that kind of money to, and yet, he broke down pretty badly physically in his early to mid 30s.
Right. Or Jose Reyes. I mean, the Mets got away from that contract, luckily, but that's another guy that seemed like he was going to be a fantastic player, and then just almost instantly washed out. And it is musical chairs, right? Like, is Manny Machado worth it? I don't know. We'll see. He's kind of erratic and there's a lot of players that are making a lot of money. Is Bryce Harper worth it? Maybe, if you don't win, is it worth it? And then these other guys that are coming down the pipe at the end of this year and next year, there's, I don't know, what, seven $250 million contracts or more sitting right there waiting. And then how many
Well,
teams?
I think with the Padres, there's also the kind of good money after bad thing of like, do you need to spend big money on Tatis in order to justify the money you already gave to Machado and Hosmer, right? Because the last thing you want to do is spend all this money to try to build a contending team and then decide that you're out of money and let one of your superstars walk, and then you've wasted the money you spent. I mean, right? Like the Rangers when they spent all that money on A-Rod and Chan Ho Park, right? And people blamed A-Rod because he was the A-list contract there, right? But
Right.
the real problem was that they spent all this money on Park, who washed out, and then they had wasted that, and they'd spent all their money on A-Rod, and then they didn't spend money to surround A-Rod with winners. And then it was like, okay, what did you give him $250 million for, right? Like, you go big or go home. You spend $250 million on your cornerstone player. You have to invest in building around him.
I'm curious about your thoughts. So when you talk about teams, and one of the things that we try to understand about baseball is like we think that the big money teams like the Yankees and the Dodgers just buy the best available player, but they don't, and they haven't for a long time. I mean, Brian Cashman has done some of that, but also because championships are the standard for the Yankees. But you look at the Dodgers, they may let their best players go because they've got excellent players behind them and they develop the heck out of players, or they take those developed players and rotate them for something else like a year of Yu Darvish or whatever it's going to be. So if you when you look at the Mets, are the Mets competent enough at developing talent, do you think, to continue to let, like, when Pete Alonso comes up for free agency, and we're a few years off from that still, but do they just let him walk because they know they can develop as somebody else, or are most of the guys Duda as opposed to Alonso, and they have to buy this talent? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think it's premature to ask that about the Mets because you have a new ownership team, and so past results may not guarantee future performance. But I mean, their system has produced a number of good players over the last couple of years, so they've got at least at the farm system level, they've got a pretty decent start to
Right.
work from. And you had some guys you could trade as trade chips. I mean, Andres Jimenez clearly was one of the keys to why they were able to make the Lindor deal, right? And
Right.
they were able to go to the Indians and say, look, we'll give you Rosario and Jimenez, and that's a chip you can cash in. I mean, in Alonso's case, I guess that there's also, I mean, you've also produced some other guys, at that position. So, but I don't know that they have anybody else in the pipeline yet, but behind him.
Yeah. And then one of the other questions I'm always thinking about is we talk about small market teams. It turns out Oakland is not in a small market. Oakland is in a massive market. San Diego is not a small market. It is a massive market. And so, what do you think? What are the true small market teams where they have to struggle to compete with the bigger teams? That because the Dodgers spend a lot of money, but they spend it on training and they spend it on development and they spend it on IDing players, international. They spend a lot of money that you don't see on the field for several years, and they're able to buy lottery tickets, so their money has power. But who are the teams that truly can't compete? Because the A's, if they chose to, have access to billions of dollars in revenue if they're able to put butts in the seats and activate media contracts and whatnot.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that go into it. I mean, right, the A's. I mean, notoriously, the A's problem has been, the fact that the Giants would never let them move to build a new ballpark, right? Because the idea is that if you move to like San Jose, you're moving into the Giants' territory. Never mind that they're already in the Giants' territory, but the Giants, the way that rule is written, the territory rule is written, you could stay where you are, but even if you move further away, that's in their territory and they can block it.
Yeah.
And I think the A's problem has never really been the TV market so much, although they do have to compete with the Giants in the TV market. But people didn't love driving into Oakland, obviously, to go to games. I mean, the size of a market obviously depends in part on who the competition is. right? How many other teams are in the market, and also if you have an installed base of baseball fans. I think the Marlins have had trouble building. I mean, the Marlins have a particular problem because they keep their fans have kind of PTSD from all the times they've burned down the roster.
Yeah.
Um, clearly, like the Royals and the Pirates have had pretty small markets, but I don't know why the Pirates necessarily have to have a tiny market. Pittsburgh isn't that small a city. It's got a great baseball tradition. But it is also the part of the problem that the Pirates have too is that they don't have a ton of Western territory, right?
Mm.
Because you go much west of there, and you've got Indians fans and Reds fans. So they don't have like what the Cardinals have, the kind of regional market. And the fact that the Cardinals have such an installed regional market and had it for such a long time is part of the reason why the Royals don't have a large market, right? Because a lot of the area that could have been potential Royals territory is already Cardinals fans.
Yeah. Well, and the Cardinals and Cubs and Braves also did a great job of mastering media early, for the different times that they were there. So, TBS just put the Braves on everybody's map, and then the Braves got good. You remember back when the Cubs and the Braves were terrible, but you could watch
Oh
them
yeah,
all you know. And then the radio days for St. Louis and for the Cubs, you could hear a Cubs game in Iowa and Nebraska, and so that's Cubs territory or Cardinals territory, and so then the Royals come in years and years later, and it's like, well, we already have our bodies assigned for the next couple of generations. Thank you so much for showing up, Royals. Great ballpark, but just not quite enough people.
yeah. Go back to the '30s, and Ronald Reagan was broadcasting Cubs games into the Iowa market. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. All right, I want to ask a little bit about the Biden presidency and some of the things you see. Like you and I were talking off mic. We have to move on. Donald Trump. It turns out, I don't know if you know this or not, he's not the president anymore. We have a new guy in office, and we always forget this. We talked about choosing the lesser of two evils, which means you're picking evil. So we have a guy that still wasn't anybody's top choice. I mean, Joe Biden was a joke in his own party. Kamala Harris' candidacy was destroyed by one question from Tulsi Gabbard. She earned as many delegates as you and I. So these aren't people that are loved for their credentials. They're loved for their party, maybe. But what do we do now that we have a president that is, as problematic? Because Joe Biden just wasn't a great candidate ever, and now he's the boss.
yeah, and he's look, he's 78 years old. He's nothing Joe Biden is or does is going to get any better from here, right? This is as good as it gets. Obviously from my perspective, it's very unfortunate that Republicans lost control of the Senate at the end of the election season, and so Biden does have the power to ram through a lot of things, but he's got to get all 50 Democrats on his side, and that's he has a very small margin for error and a surprisingly small margin in the House. That hasn't been an issue yet, but undoubtedly there are some things that there are going to be some constraints even on what the Democrats can do in the House when you've only got like an 8 or 9 seat majority. But Joe Manchin right now, and not only Manchin, Kristen Sinema as well, can kind of dictate terms to the Democrats. I mean, the fact that they can't get anything through the filibuster is precisely why we're seeing so much attention on spending money, right? Because that's the one thing that you can do with 50 votes. Well, the two things you could do with 50 votes in the Senate, right, is taxes and spending. And the sheer amount of spending that they're looking at doing is just staggering. And it really is, a lot of it is aimed at, payoffs to their constituencies, ways to fund their own advocacy organizations. That's even their big voting bill, which obviously isn't getting anywhere in the Senate. It has all these provisions about, it basically wants the federal government to take over the job of registering college students, which is previously a major expenditure for the Democratic Party. So a lot of what they're trying to do is to essentially funnel taxpayer money to benefit themselves, and to benefit, the teachers' unions and state and local governments and blue states and all that sort of thing. But the amount of spending that they're proposing is just staggering. I mean, it's just, and people say, well, yeah, but didn't George W. Bush spend a lot of money? Didn't Donald Trump spend a lot of money? Didn't Reagan spend a lot of money? Yeah, I mean, the choice is always between irresponsible Republicans and catastrophically irresponsible Democrats. But I think there's two things that people miss about that, right? One of which is that, with a few occasional exceptions, like Bush pushing the Medicare Part D, when Republicans spend money, they tend to go out and be like, okay, let's spend some money this year. Whereas the Democrats are like, put in a new program that will spend this amount of money every year until, like, the sun freezes and the earth is a frozen ball of ice. And the other thing is that the sheer quantity of what Biden is trying to spend here is far and away beyond anything we've ever seen in American history. I mean, 1.9 trillion for his COVID relief bill, much of which has nothing to do with COVID relief, and a good deal of which isn't even supposed to be spent this year. And then you add on to that another 2.3 trillion that he's trying to spend in this infrastructure package. And then, there's talk that there may be another $2 trillion like education and other social program spending bill on the way. Once you're talking about like $6 trillion, I mean, that's like what, $50,000 for every household in the country. Where are you going to get that money? It's crazy.
Yeah, and this is like, I'm no fan of the Republicans. I have a place in my heart for everybody, but what are the Republicans going to do about this? I mean, if the spending horse leaves the barn, and we don't know when this will happen, when like there's just too much money, being spent, and there's going to be a devaluation of the dollar, hyperinflation, whatever it's going to be. There's going to be a cost for this money. What are the Republicans doing about it? I mean, they put together candidates that weren't terribly exciting for the presidency. Then we had Donald Trump, and who's going to be next? Another Donald Trump presidency? Please, let's lose something else. Let's get somebody in there who can help with this. And the Democrats are just as guilty. Their guy's Joe Biden. This is the party that had an Asian dude running, and Tulsi Gabbard, who's a veteran and has people of color background, and they picked the old black guy. But only after the other old black guy who brought $100 million into the election was kicked out, didn't garner enough votes. So we're not keeping our
right.
best.
I mean, it was sort of amazing when they got to the point where Biden was out there and he's 77 and he was the third oldest guy on the stage next to Sanders and Bloomberg. Bloomberg's actually older than Biden is. He may not look it, but he is.
I can't take these parties seriously, either of them. And this is what we got to choose from. And all of this incredible people in this nation who could probably do a pretty solid job, even if they just held the rudder down the middle. Why do we get such crap people? I mean, these aren't. This is not our best and brightest, no matter who's on the stage in any of these debates.
Yeah, I mean, one of my longstanding things is I always feel like we ought to have people who are experienced and accomplished, and particularly as governors. I think that's a better way to go. And it wasn't so long ago that you'd see Reagan and George W. Bush and even Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, that the parties would go to governors, right? You'd get somebody who sort of made their bones outside of the Beltway, who had proven that they could run something. And hopefully we'll see that, at least given us a serious fair hearing this time around. But I mean, the governors got massacred in the Democratic primary this time around, and obviously most of them got squashed in the Trump race too. I mean, the people who were left standing against Trump. I mean, yeah, Kasich sort of simply by staying in the race got some votes, but I mean, he was finishing like 8th and 9th early on, and then all of the other governors got sort of run off the road. So the only people who were left really with Trump even were relatively young senators. So I do think that the parties need to give more thought again to bringing in presidential candidates who have actually run something in the past.
What about outsiders? I mean, can either party legitimately run an outsider right now, or are we over outsiders for a while?
I mean, I think, the Democrats obviously are just going to run, 4 years from now they're going to run Biden or Harris, presumably. And so I don't think they're going to have a whole lot of openings for that. On the Republican side, I don't know that I can see another outsider candidate who is not Trump and who is not like, say, one of Trump's kids. And at this point, they're not outsiders anymore, right? I mean, you can't get more insider than being a former president of the United States. But I don't think you're going to see a different outsider. I mean, there are some people who think, well, maybe Tucker Carlson might run, right? Because he's a media guy. Although, he's again one of these. It's sort of like when Pat Buchanan ran, like, oh yeah, you're going to run a guy as. I mean, Buchanan was the ultimate sort of, on the one hand, outsider. On the other hand, a guy who was literally born in D.C. and worked in the White House and everything, right? I mean, Tucker has been such a part of the political media establishment for so long. It's hard to really think of him as a genuine outsider. But I don't think we're going to see another true outsider for a while. I think the Republicans are probably going to end up going back towards a somewhat more conventional candidate next time, unless it's Trump again. So we'll see.
Trump isn't worth the squeeze. Like the juice that you get, whatever good he does. Like he ran on term limits. People talk about term limits all the time. Like, well, Trump ran on that. Like, yeah, I can't do it. Like it's just he creates too much. He purposely talk about unforced errors, Dan. There's the king of unforced errors, where he just purposely smashes his own success all the time.
But I think even if you're going to make kind of the devil's advocate case for Trump, and I'm certainly somebody who has a very long record as a Trump critic. I think the devil's advocate case for Trump, though, is that sometimes you need to bring somebody in who breaks things, shakes things up, and prepares the way, right, for somebody. So you need the revolutionary personality, and then after that's happened, then you need somebody to come in and fix it, actually fix it, not just break a bunch of things that were wrong, but create new things that work. So even if you take that position, right? Even if you take that position that is sympathetic to Trump, that says, look, we needed that guy to come in here and shake up the way people thought about things and shake up the way people talked about things. And, we needed a chaos agent, right? Okay. If you buy the argument that we needed a chaos agent, we don't need to bring him back for more chaos. We don't need to bring in a different guy for more additional and different chaos, right? At that point, then you need to be able to go back and say, let's get somebody who actually can build something.
Is it possible for any presidential candidate who wins to actually have a mandate right now? They all claim it, but they never have it. George Bush, the elder or the senior, didn't have it. George Bush, the younger, didn't have it. Bill Clinton didn't have it. Who can have a mandate anymore? Is that even not a thing? Like if you talk about uniting, nothing that Joe Biden is doing is uniting people. He's just, continuing to do. And then the person on the right who comes in next will do the same thing. And the party system is really struggling to find mandates.
It is harder. It has gotten harder. I think it depends. I think part of it too is that, you have to read your mandate correctly.
Okay.
I think Trump had a mandate to do some things. I think he could legitimately claim that he had a mandate to do tougher immigration, to rethink trade, and up to a point, he did some of those things. Obama, for example, Obama had 60 senators, right, coming in after a financial crisis. I think Obama actually had a pretty strong mandate to come in and do financial services stuff, right, to fix Wall Street. And he did some of that, and he did it badly. But with Dodd-Frank, he did it in a way that was sort of conventional and just piled more regulatory, glop on top of the existing structure. I actually think he might have had a mandate to do some more sweeping populist-y things there. But he decided instead he wanted to low-key that and spend his political capital on healthcare, which was not really the big driver. Yeah, it was certainly part of it was not really the big driver, I think, of that election. I think George W. Bush actually had a pretty good mandate in some ways because on domestic policy, I mean, his foreign policy was very much a mandate that he had because of events that happened after he was in office.
Sure.
But I think Bush came in with a certain mandate because he had governed in Texas in a particular way. He had done certain things in Texas, and he ran for president on the grounds that I'm going to do the same things in the White House that I did in Texas. And he essentially did those things, right? I mean, his domestic policy, tax cuts, this kind of top-down education reform, even the Medicare Part D, those were the things he ran on. And so he was able to get some of those things done through Congress, maybe not exactly the way he wanted them, but in his first couple of years in office, he was able to get things done because he ran on stuff he'd already done and run on doing them again. So I think you have a window as a new president to do some of that. And certainly Biden was able to squeeze out some of that just based on, on COVID relief, even though he snuck a lot of things in there. But Biden's problem, I think, is that an awful lot of his mandate, it's two things, right? Which is get us out of the pandemic and don't be Trump, right? Because a lot of people were just sick of Trump. They wanted Trump to go. They just make the man go away, make him go away, make him stop, make him shut up, make him leave. And Biden already done that, right? All he has to do is not be Trump, and that's the easy part.
Yeah. Well, and given his questionable, I'll say, mental state, it's probably good that he kind of just holds up and lets things kind of just go at a different pace than what Donald Trump is doing. Donald Trump's reelection campaign platform, though, was pretty strong. I mean, he had some he came in and I don't want to say he fulfilled more promises than any recent president, but you had to at least on the surface go, he may actually do something about term limits. He may actually, get us out of these foreign entanglements. He may actually continue to support local business and make things happen. It's just he's so unpalatable. He's so odious. It's I'm sure the people that held their nose and voted for him, were like, I'm voting for the the hopeful good things, and now that's all gone, and now we have to see what Joe Biden's capable of doing. And look, just on his record, I don't know that he can. I want to give the guy a chance. I want him to succeed, but I don't know that he's capable of getting things right because I mean, there has not been a good foreign policy president probably since George Bush the Elder, but nobody among the four people that ran for president, vice president were any good at foreign policy. Domestic policy, we're a mess because we can't. Everybody wants all the people that want us to be a socialist country. We don't get along good enough to be a socialist country. We can't agree on the kind of democracy or republic we are. I mean, you can say fine, but now we're a socialist country. Not going to get along. Not going to go in the same direction. So I don't know, man. It's a mess. I don't know if we look at these sort of middle of the road in terms of performance presidents going from, let's say, Bill Clinton on through to Donald Trump. It's hard to get your rating above 50% anytime later in your term because we just don't do that. I mean, people don't want to hear it, but Barack Obama and Donald Trump have similar approval ratings. I mean, it's just true. So are we looking at just continuing to tear ourselves apart where we break into many states, many little micronations? Are we past a point of no return? Is this all just like, we'll be all right. We continue to do the big things well, and we're going to continue to do them well? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts about the future?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can look back at American history and say, well, we have been through worse than this, and more divisive than this.
We actually went through. Actually happened.
Right. I mean, we had literally a civil war. I mean, you look at even the 1930s, the 1790s. Like there were a lot of very rough periods in American history. And if you looked at any given time in history, there were always trends that if you looked at them at the time and you said, well, if things keep going in this direction, but things never keep going in the same direction, right? Something always changes. And boy, what's the line about, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. Now, the things that worry me the most are the things that seem to have been going in the same direction for a long time without stop, right? I mean, that the government keeps growing forever. That we have, for example, a declining and aging population. Do we have skyrocketing debt? That we have, if you look at the cost of healthcare, it just only goes up. If you look at the cost of education, it only goes up. If you look at the left-wing trends in education and entertainment and journalism, they just keep going in one direction forever. And so that is something that worries me, is those things that look like trends that will last forever. But sooner or later they won't, right? And we've seen too many times in history the way things break and change away from where they were. I mean, yeah, if you were, if you were like, a black American in 1930, right? You would have looked at well, where has everything gone since like 1876, right? It's all gone in one direction, and none of it's been good. And you might have predicted that that's going to go on forever, and it didn't. Eventually, it turned. And so, and you could look at a lot of different things in American history, from foreign policy to uh, to our economy, to things looked like they were going in one direction forever, and then they stopped and turned around. So I think I'm not necessarily ready to despair that we are digging ourselves into permanent trenches that will never move. But there's no question that just looking at the electorate and the culture, that there seems to be less given the joints than there has been in the past. Less immediate change. On the other hand, hey, if anybody had told you in like the spring of 2016, right, that in the fall of 2020, that Donald Trump would be running for re-election, that turnout would be at a record high, and that Trump would have the best performance among non-white voters in like, decades for a Republican, they would have looked at you like you're absolutely crazy. Now, does that mean that Trump, first of all, you would have thought that Trump would have won in that situation, and he didn't. And you would certainly not look at those results and say, well, gee, everything went hunky dory for Republicans in a lot of ways, even with non-white voters. But the point is that when you see a shift like that, and you saw some fairly dramatic shifts in some areas, and those shifts aren't necessarily permanent trends either, but they are a reminder that things eventually can and do change beyond what you would predict.
Would you say that so Donald Trump, yeah, again, goes the election and he gets more votes than any sitting president ever. Did Joe Biden's team just do a better job of playing all of the cards that are in the deck? I'm trying to be very careful I say this. Look, I don't know that either side didn't cheat. I think they both probably did at some level. And I've always said, like, as a spy, like, you give me a small budget, I can go out and flip. You tell me which districts you want to flip, and you give me a couple $1 million, I could probably get that done, because there's people out there that will do a lot of things for a small amount of money. It's just not that complicated to do. But I don't know. Do we have a voter fraud problem, do you think?
I mean, I think the question is, do we have a problem, or do we have a huge problem, right? And I think obviously the answer is that we have vulnerabilities in the system, and every year some people exploit those, and a certain number of those people get arrested and charged. And simple common sense tells you that for every person who gets arrested and charged, there are probably at least a couple out there. I mean, are we catching 100% of voter fraud? I think that's highly unlikely. We're probably catching less than 50%. We might be catching less than 30 or 20%. I don't know. But on the other hand, are we catching like 1%? No, we're probably catching more than that, I would think. So I don't think that there's, when you see in any given election cycle, a couple of dozen, a dozen people or a couple of dozen people get arrested for voter fraud, I don't think that means that we have like 10 million fraudulent votes out there. But I think it's enough that, it certainly can be a real risk of swinging a close election. I mean, we just had an election in Iowa for a House seat. The House is divided by like 9 seats as it is, 8 seats. And we just had one of them decided by 6 votes. Now, you tell me, is it possible, given the volume of voter fraud that we know about that gets caught every year, Can you have as many as 6 fraudulent votes in a House district? Oh hell yes, hell yes. And so that does not mean that we should be like totally overhauling our electoral system, but it means that we should remember that this is still something that can be a real threat to the integrity of our elections, and we should take modest steps, which is what I think for the most part most of the Republican proposals have done, which is to take relatively modest steps to and some of those steps deter fraud. It's not just that they catch fraud, they deter it, that when people see that you're being asked for ID, that you're keeping a paper trail of votes and things like that, it deters shenanigans, not just voter fraud, but also other kinds of electoral fraud, in the counting of votes and the in the mailing and in the registration, and there's all different points to the system. So, I mean, I think this is something that we know has been a huge problem at times in America's history, right? In the past, we know that. We know that there's still a motive to do it. If anything, a greater motive now because of how intense people are about politics. And so I think you take common sense steps to deal with that.
You got time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if you know Matt Brainerd's work, and one of the problems with Matt Brainerd is he's very right leaning and open about it. He'll do his YouTube video with a Trump sign behind him, but he went through and did some cross state. He did several different voter checks, right? And I'm not making a commentary on his work. I'm curious what you think of it, but he said, okay, let's call people who voted and their vote wasn't tabulated. Did they know that? And then there are people like, no, I thought it was. And then there was the opposite where, did you realize you voted in the election? No, I didn't. And then they also cross-checked voter rolls between states and found a lot of what appears to be double voting for people who are, say, residents in California who voted in Nevada or Arizona. And again, these are all states that were, severe swing states. So what are your thoughts on his work? Are you familiar enough with it to even comment?
Yeah, I don't want to get into sort of detail of his specific stuff, but I've certainly seen some of the studies that have been done on that have found certainly that examples of people who are lots of people who are registered in multiple jurisdictions, and certainly have that there's not really an adequate safeguard to prevent them from being voted in multiple jurisdictions. I think one of the things that concerns me is the timetables here, right? What's one of the simplest methods to keep people from voting in 2 states? Well, if everybody's got to vote on the same day, you can't go too many places in one day, right? If you've got a month to vote, you can go a lot more places. And I mean, the way the Democrats want to set things up is that you can start voting a month before Election Day, and you can still change your registration on Election Day or register in a new place. You can walk into a voting booth, walk into a polling place and say, yeah, I'm registered to vote, except I want to make sure that you guys change my name and address there, and I'll vote under that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not good security. And so I think compressing the time has a certain time and space still matter in these things. If you have a reasonably compressed time and space in which to cast your ballot, that there's still adequate time for anyone to vote once, but maybe puts a greater burden on people who are trying to vote more than once.
I don't care what party you're from. If you make a system that's more permissive, more people are going to exploit that permissibility. I mean, that's just what's going to happen, especially when the stakes are as high as they are. And so we've got to figure it out. In California, you cannot buy ammo unless you have an upgraded driver's license. Like you have to have we call it the real ID. It's the one that will allow you to fly. It's like not a passport, but it's more than just a regular California license. That's just to buy bullets. Bullets aren't at all, and we also have very permissive, absentee balloting, which again I'm fine with, but let's confirm that you're not voting in more than one place. And at some point, if we continue to create opportunities for exploitation, then everybody's going to exploit the integrity of our elections, and then the UN's going to be here validating our elections as opposed to us being with the UN somewhere else validating somebody else's, and it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, and don't ask how the UN got elected. But yeah, I mean, and look, I mean, if you look 10 years ago, right, Republicans were pushing for, and there's always hypocrisy on both sides of this, but Republicans were pushing for voter ID, for in-person voting. And one of the big refrains from, liberal and progressive pundits and from Democrats was, well, you guys don't really care about the integrity of the vote, right? And how do we know that? Because you're not trying to do this with absentee ballots. And hey, absentee ballots are the real source of voting fraud in this country. Like the New York Times ran a big splashy story on this in like 2012, right? Absentee ballots aren't secure, and and all of that. And then now all of a sudden, when there's this big surge of Democrats voting absentee, all of a sudden, well, yes, Republicans suddenly got interested in the security of the absentee ballot, but also Democrats suddenly discovered that they didn't actually think it was a big problem. And so it's just it's completely hypocritical. And,
have the government pay you $100 if you vote, and you get paid to your Social Security card, and then we just deal with it that way. How about that?
Well, I'm not a big fan of spending even more money to get people to do what they ought to do in the first place.
All right.
As it is, if you don't vote, you stand a pretty good chance of it getting taken out of your hide by the government anyway. So,
Yeah, I hear you. All right, well, listen, let me run this thing. Hey, thanks for coming down and hanging out with me. Hold on one second. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.